And welcome to the last P5Live Sessions for 2020. We're going to keep the series going into 21, but this will be our last one of this particular year. Welcome back to P5Live Sessions. Welcome in the future streaming. What are we going to get into today? It's always a question at the start of the day or like at a random point of the day. Oh yeah, it's Tuesday. We should get into something surprising for myself. And I think as we wrap up 2020, big 2-0. That's a horrible O. I obviously don't do that competition with a circle. It's quite interesting that there are these arcs involved in the number 2020. I think there's a number of ways that we could think about arcs as we wrap up a year and go into the next. And so I think I'm going to play with the arc function, which I have little to no experience with because I almost never need this thing. I draw with lines and rects and ellipses and points and begin shape, end shape, and curve vertexes if I need curves, or vertices if I need vertices. But once in a while, maybe a student project comes up where they need a certain shape, and I know that arc is the answer, but I never ever use it. I just sort of know, hey, if you want a Pac-Man-like thing, then you probably want to use an arc, and that's about as far as I usually go with it. So this might be a fun opportunity to just experiment with an arc and see what it can do and add a bunch of them. And I can already kind of picture in my head maybe them rotating, and I remember playing a number of mazes that were based in an arc format as a kid. So maybe it's interesting playing with their rotation offset, who knows, or zooming into them, going into 3D space. Let's see. So the very first thing is we should look at the reference of how an arc even works. And this is where I remember these things that you could say at the end that it's a pi, so it's an open thing or a chord. And I think the first thing I'll do is just draw the examples and see what they look like. And they're hiding back there because they're designed for a small, like 100 by 100 canvas. So this is a few arcs that are actually probably overlapping, I believe, if I said no fill at the top and said stroke 255. There we go. Yeah, so these are a number of different arcs at different sizes, different radiuses, I'm guessing, radii. Okay, let's see what some others look like. Maybe I'll leave that on and turn this part off. Let's grab this one here. Maybe I even do a scale 4 or so just so I can see the things bigger. Okay, so that is, I have no background. That's why it's staying around. Background 0. Okay, so that is the second example. Let me grab the third example. Check out what that looks like. That looks very much like the previous one. It looks exactly like the previous one, but one of them says open, one of them says close. So I'm guessing open must be default, where I could look at the instructions. Maybe I quickly look at the reference. We give it an X, a Y, a width, and a height, and then we say a start angle for the start of the arc in radians, which is usually nice too. Instead of working with pi, just convert degrees to radians. You tell it a stop radian, and then you give it a mode of chord pi open, and then a detail is for Webgl mode. Okay, how many steps it should take to get there. So let me play with a chord and see what this is like. The same, but it's going to be different. Okay, that must be a closed form. And last but not least, a pi. Aha, okay, that's the sort of Pac-Man. So I think I'm visually kind of interested in playing with the open ones. Just what these things look like with a gap going inside of them. But it's nice to know that you can quickly either flatten off that shape or have it go inward to the center, or simply be open. We turn those off, then you get this open one. Okay, that's a decent starting point. Let's start playing with some arcs. So I'm going to turn off scale. Maybe I'm just going to start a brand new sketch. And let's say we have a background all the time. We will have no fill and stroke that is white. And then I'll draw myself an arc. Let's translate to the center of the page so that that is 0, 0. So then I can draw this thing at 0, 0. Then I set a width and a height on it. Let's make it something like height times 0.4. Let's make that a variable so that we don't copy paste twice. Let h be this, and then use it twice. And then I need a start and stop radius, and I could already put myself in angle mode, degrees, hopefully, so I don't need to use radians. And then if I said 0 and 200, we already get an arc. I'm going to make the stroke weight thicker. So that's 200, so assumably 360 is back at the top. Okay, good. So 350 should be almost closed. 340, 330. So that's kind of cool. We could do like a frame count modulo 3, maybe 59. And then we just built ourselves a little Ajax loader. Woohoo. I'm going to hide the reference, Control R. So now I've got this little Ajax loader. Maybe it should go to 360. I'm not sure. Probably doesn't make a difference. Yeah, it doesn't really make a difference. We could speed the thing up. We could slow it down. Wait for it to load. Wait for this to load. But that's interesting, just having that degree. So it starts at 0. So what you could probably also do is start at like 90, I hope, and then say 90 plus. And then we could just offset where the thing starts and stops. Yep. So that's pretty cool. That this could always be, I mean, this could even be like a frame count modulo 360. Maybe that's a variable. I could call it like offset. Let offset equal that. And then this could be offset plus that. What does this even mean? It just means it's like, I don't know. It's changing where that 0, 0 point is, and it's trying to catch its own tail. That's kind of fun. So it's probably already interesting to play with a couple of these things. Maybe the very first thing I would do would be just play with looping the whole thing. Putting it in a big old loop. Let's finish writing this. Not int, we are in JavaScript, let I equal 0. I is less than an unknown thing called LC. Let's define LC for loop count. Let's make 10 of them to start. Open that up and plop all of this inside. Control T to tidy it up. Okay, so now there's 10 of them, and now we need to do something like make them unique to each other. So maybe their size should be a map of I. Goes from 0 to LC minus 1. I want it to go from like height times 0.1 to height times 0.4, maybe to 0.5. Maybe simply height. All right, almost have radar vision, and then they should have different offsets from each other. So instead of them all being the same frame set, we just have to use I times. Ooh, that was interesting for a second there. This is also interesting. So this is like a wave catching up to each other. But when I simply had this, then we get this cool whip vision. And what exactly is happening? It's kind of each one of those is going that much faster of the frame count. So the frame count is whipping even faster on the outer side than the inside. I think we need to have a little bit of a faded background here. See what this is like, leaving a bit of a trace. Probably has to be less leaving of a trace. There we go. Viewers will slowly get hypnotized. Could do a whole series just on building loaders. Yeah, so that's quite cool, letting that happen. It's probably also nice just slowing everything down. I'm going to make less of a fade. Oops, we have a error there. Plus. There we go. So now they are barely different than each other with 0.1. Maybe we do need a big number here. There we go. Now we get kind of a tail spinning quality, like a wave. Maybe times 25. That lets some of them be way faster than the others. They're still resetting at the same point, so that's kind of maybe not so cool that they're at the exact same moment all clearing each other. It's probably worth trying to make them unique in that regard. What is this like? As they just get even further, I bet when you throw in some weird numbers, just guess and checking numbers, we can get some nice relationships of these values to each other. Start to get into like toxic sign territory. Maybe their stroke weight should be unique to each other. At some point we probably want to push and pop. But let me just say like 1 plus I times 2. So they're getting either thick on the outside or the inside. Let's go for an even number, a bigger number. Maybe it's also nice letting that number grow on us so it's not so constant, but I think the first thing I want to do is make these not reset at the exact same phase, because I think that's not so fun that that's happening constantly. So here we had this plugged in, and maybe it's nice that that's a variable instead, and just say like, I guess that was technically start and stop. Let's call it those things. Start, let stop equal this thing. That is now stop. This is now start. And this is start. And it should come back. So I'm going to tell stop to stop being this big thing going around and just be like start plus 60. And then we get to see that fixed amount of the arc, 60 degrees of it spinning around, or 120 degrees of it. Yeah, it's interesting that we can open up this idea I kind of had in my head at the very beginning when thinking about an arc is this kind of just having a gap that's open. Let's get rid of the blur. So this already creates something kind of like a maze, maybe. If I said it was 5 and I stopped spinning this thing around, let's simply hack that off. I think you could pretty quickly, actually it's not a very complicated maze because there's nothing like blocking off sections, but can create some interesting spirals. I think this stroke weight should now be mapped. Goes from, let's say, 0.2 up to 5. So that can create some interesting gaps in there. If these were short segments, that also creates interesting, I could imagine them kind of wobbling in and out. And then maybe it's interesting that this value kind of grows and shrinks in terms of how much of those, how much is there? Mouse, Y. Let's use the mouse to make this thing interactive. So that's what it's like if it's kind of moving like so. So there were two things. One thing was, that's kind of also nice. This is like the invert of this But two interesting things: to have them reset on their own position, to be unique when they reset, and then maybe also the size of them could pulse a little bit, kind of like a 3D wave. So what do we need to do? I think, I don't know, let's go back to what we had before. They're already doing that. And then this sort of reset. Was there a hiccup? No, I might have just been playing with the mouse. Okay. Let me just fix them at like 90 degrees. And let me bring this down so it's clear to see what these things are doing. That's also nice, just having these things spiral out. But they're all moving at the exact same speed. And so this might be where they should get unique values here. If I said times I times 0.1, for example, then they're going at much different speeds from each other, times 0.4 or 3. Then the outside ones are whipping that much faster around. That's kind of interesting. Maybe also with a blur. Even less of a blur, or more of a blur rather. Leave more of a trail. Ooh, there it starts to get a sort of, yeah, it becomes almost 3D from this texture it leaves behind. With even more leftover blur. Can play with how fast those things spin around. There, that moment right there is nice and 3D. So I have a feeling it'll get quite trippy when these things can also pulse in and out, so they're not fixed at this this relationship that they have, this height, but let them also yeah, come towards us and away from us. And maybe it has to be going through some kind of a sine or so. So I think what I'm going to do is say H is down here, and I'm going to create something called, I don't know, let H pulse. Now let's just call it pulse. Pulse equals a sine of frame count times. I have to remember I'm in angle mode, so all these like frame count times have changed from what I'm normally playing with, but let's try this. And then let's just say plus pulse, and get rid of that, and I see nothing happening. There we go. Yeah, the frame count is so much different now inside of angle mode. Normally you have to take a fraction of it, but now we actually need probably a larger number. There we go. So now we have like a 2 times oscillating fan. It's oscillating in a cylindrical way and towards us, and maybe bring that blur back. Maybe want to let the thing get way big so we're immersed by this thing. It's not stuck on the page. That starts to leave some nice trails. I think it should actually be slowed down. And I think it should also be at different rates from one another. Right now they're all pulsing at the same, and that's where we need to use I. So I times 5 plus, let's go back to actually seeing everything so we can tell what kind of pulse they're making. Starts to become a little bit like a camera iris. Yeah, so they're going fairly slow. Where were we here? Let's speed them up a bit. There, so we can see the motion that's happening. We could even make more of these arcs. And maybe the offset between them should be more different. Now it's a bigger gap between them. It's a little hard to see, I bet, if I take away. If I add the blur, then we can see a little bit better what's happening here. We need a little bit more clearing away so that we don't build up too many shapes at once. Okay, and I'm going to go back to letting these things surround the page. Let's just go 2. Yep, some kind of crazy wheel spinning thing. Let's play with what some of these different speeds can offer us. This is slowing that down a little bit, its rotation. We can slow it way down. Everything is fixed now at 90, and this is where it's probably also nice to let those change their length again. Starts to look trippier and trippier. I start to see maybe gills of a mushroom in there. Although those would probably be a little bit different fanned out from the center. Let's go back to this 90 and play with this number. So instead of there being 90 or 5, that's maybe also interesting just to have a tiny little number and see what these things look like. That they look more like little autonomous spinning things instead of being an arc. 2, they could be really tiny on some kind of a trajectory. Or we let them be quite a bit. Let's go all the way up to like 360. And then that's basically we're just drawing a circle now. But playing with it in a way different way than I think I would have if I was just playing with ellipses. I think I also want this pulsing to go in the opposite direction. It's kind of having this wave going in rather than out, which I think I could do if I just make this -50. I think that changed what it was doing a little bit. Or what happens if I say ABS? No, I think it's nice. It can go in both directions. And now I'm able to trip out my keyboard by just staring at this thing for a little while and then looking at the keyboard. Definitely I've created an optical illusion. Trippy vision. Let's see. So what else do we want to do this thing? I think I want to go back to playing with this not being 360, but just a section of this. And maybe that needs to be, maybe it's either a frame count, which we played with before, or a sine could be nice. And say this is sine of frame count plus I times 5 times 360. So then this is going to be like working its way up into getting into 360 and then assumably going back and going, it's going to like whip backwards as it goes into the negative directions. And there's so many different things to try out, from taking away that blur. So now we have nice crisp lines doing their spinning thing. There's different stroke weights which could be taken away. There's the speed at which it's moving. There is how immersive this thing is. Maybe I switch the stroke weight to be starting thick in the center and getting thin as it goes outward. Will give us a almost like a, oh, what is that called? Damn. Where it gets kind of soft at the edges. Not soft, but darker at the corners. Yeah, I think there's a bunch of interesting relationships to find. Maybe it's nice to slow this whole thing down a little bit. Oh yeah, and this is also a huge area to play. What exactly is the offset of this, of each of these, using I within this sine wave. how close are the numbers to each other. If I go 0.2, they're going to be super close to each other, and then they'll kind of act like they're very, very connected, and the higher number you get, the more disassociative each of those lines get from each other. Just have to try all the numbers. Infinite. That also makes a nice relationship, but really tightly connected to each other. Ooh, that's nice. This moment where there's just like, they're getting kind of bigger than each other, but not filling up the page. So that could also be nice to say, hey, you don't get up to 360, you only get up to 60. Does that work? Maybe. Interesting. It just means they don't hang out as long filling the page. There's so many things to test out. The difference being not so far from each other. They're only 5 offset from each other. Or 50 apart from each other. Whoops, 50. What if this is a really slow spinning? Or we have to try the opposite and speed that thing up. Whoops. Times, let's start that over. So that was 1 times 3. I was at 5. Let's jump up to like 8. And now we get an interesting tack, 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 tack as it moves down into the center. So there's some special relationship with 8 that's keeping it very lined up. Let's try just much bigger numbers, like up to 20. Because then at a certain point with the sine wave, it'll give this appearance of a couple waves happening at once instead of one bigger wave going in. Who knows what that number needs to be. And I'm going to bring this back up to let them surround the whole screen. Yeah, it seems a little chaotic at that speed. Unless you go up to a way high number and then maybe you hit some really interesting relationships. What does it mean if it's like 60 and 360, if those numbers can fit into each other? That's making a weird pulse. Yeah, I guess it makes a big difference when these numbers are so big. It gets, yeah, maybe just too fast. Pretty soon we're going to have to go into 3D and tilt the thing and see what it's like in a Z-axis when those things actually move forward and back. Okay, that's like the whole thing pulsing versus having a couple ripples within it. And this actually kind of appears to be like a Z-axis because it's about these things pulsing up and down. So if instead of 50 I say 150, it's going to give the impression that these things really move forward and back, and then that is probably hard to watch. And so I'm going to slow the whole thing down and say, let's slow it down, but let them go that far down and that far forward. Maybe it's time to introduce a bit of color into this. First, let's add even more and let my fan kick on. What's it like having, now we have 120 of these things that maybe need to be much thinner because there's so many. Or if there's only 20 or 10, let's go 20. What does that mean when there's only a few in there? think I'm going to mess around with color mode HSB 100. And then I think the fade disappears a bit. And now let's make the stroke unique between each of these. So I can turn this off for a bit and put it here. And let's set the stroke at 0. Its hue saturation is 0. Its brightness is 100. Then we get white. And if I say 20, oh yeah, right, we still have the saturation down. If I go up to 50 or 100, then we get to play in color. Can go through and check out a couple colors, and it might be nice just to play with 2 colors in there. So to kind of, yeah, maybe just take the even odds of I. So what should we do? We should go plus and say I modulo 2 times 20. And then they should be a gap of 20 apart from each other. So then I could go and play with those 2 colors. And now I think we want to go back to having a dense array of these things. And test out different relationships of color. And maybe a bit of blur because we're in 2D. Let's take advantage of being able to blur. So 0, 0, and then 20 will give us a little bit of alpha. Or 10. And I don't have to stick to a certain color here. We could also let this thing work its way slowly through the color wheel. It might be nice to let this thing slowly shift over time. It's also a question, what's the best relationship between those 2 colors? How much should they be split apart from each other? Yeah, 20 seemed pretty good. Of getting 2 colors that are similar but not the same. And I think here we can do something like a frame count modulo 100. Oh, which goes way too fast. Times 0.1. And change some of these other numbers in terms of, I guess let's see what this looks like again contained on the page. Almost. Zoomed way into it. Here we get a little bit of 3D texture from the fade where these lines are zooming in and out. So if I have even less opacity, we'll get even bigger of these 3D shadings. I think I'm going to slow down the color so that it lingers quite a bit longer on a given shade. And just has like this really smooth transition from one color into another. It's almost looking Looney Tunes-like at moments. And I think it's worth changing up some of the speeds at which these things are moving. To slow them down or speed them up and see what that changes. Some interesting relationships happening in the timing. Ooh, that was a nice shading that just occurred. Yeah, it's really nice when you get these illusions of 3D moments and crazy complex shading that start to look like 3D objects just from leaving a trace, a slowly faded out trace in 2D. Those are really fun moments to get in 2D. Yeah, there's like a sharp moment. It starts to look like a flower or a rose if it's the right color. I'm sure this can be influenced by how much those things are allowed to grow. If they're not always doing 360 degrees, then they'll be more fractured. And then maybe they can spin faster at a smaller angle. That's a nice combo, kind of a dark blue, light blue. There was another big value here, this offset between them all. If I go down to 5, this is probably where it's fun to just install a bunch of sliders and let this be an interactive sketch where you just have like every single spot there's a number, it's a slider, and then it's just a guess and check game to control the color of it, the speed of it, like there's 4 or 5 different spots where speed could go in and manipulate things. This pulse again, for how deep those go, let's send them even further into a pulse. Probably also should slow it down. Bit interesting to let that thing go even more towards us and away from us, which will make all those 3D illusion shadings that much more intense. Until a certain point, maybe they break if they are allowed to move too fast. Wow, that starts to get very full of depth, although I can start to see those lines, so I'm also going to slow this down and say do the same thing, but just slower. And I think I want to change up that relationship here. Something else, so there maybe it just should also be on a sine or so that this number here is constantly changing and not always fixed, but it might be. I'm not sure if that can be a flexible number. If I say mouse Y, does that end up getting really choppy when it changes? I think so, because we're using frame count as well. But I guess actually with mouse Y, it lets you quickly find some of those interesting relationships. If you were printing out the number, then you would know 14 is the perfect amount that these things should be. That's actually a pretty good spot right there. Whoop, too high. Yeah, lots of interesting numbers in there. Maybe it is worth just to quickly check what is my mouse Y right now. It is 24. Okay, good to know. So let's test out having 24 there for a while. Have just a few of these things. And I'm curious, if I were to jump into Webgl, we would lose this fade unless I drew everything on a layer instead. But it'd be interesting how much of these qualities stick around, or do you lose some of this stuff when you go to Webgl? One way to find out. So let's have our nice faded one, but be prepared for it to just be like so. Let's change to Webgl. One nice thing about translating at the beginning is then you can just turn off translate and then you're all good. This looks similar, except we maybe want to turn down the detail. So I could say 4, and then these things will be, I can make them also, yeah, I guess you can make them not such smooth arcs. And assumably you get a little bit better performance. But it looks fairly similar, except those lines are just not as smooth. Even at 24, I can still see the segments a little bit. So that's interesting that in Webgl, maybe you just have to expect you'll get some of those ridges. Although I should look at the reference and see what happens with arc. What is the detail allowed to be up? The default is 25. Okay. So I guess it's up to you. Whoops. How many you want to go for? So let's try 50. doesn't look significantly smoother. But also kind of surprising that 5 didn't look very rough either. Maybe. Okay, but we're in 3D, so let's play with... actually, before I go into 3D, I lied. I'm going to quickly clone the sketch. So I have a 2D version. Let's give this a quick name. What is this thing? This is like arc tunnel. Not a tunnel, but a tunnel. And then let's clone it. Whoops. Give it a better name. Call it Webgl. And now go into Webgl. Okay, and because we're in Webgl now, we could do all kinds of fun things like orbit control 5 is the favorite thing to just quickly throw in there because we're in 3D, so now we get to go and check out that cool space. And now we could turn this into a fun like Saturn rings thing by just adding one sphere in the center. Sphere 100 is probably big enough. No, it's not. Yes, it was. Maybe I need to do a push and a pop around it. Tell it to have a fill that is white and no stroke and maybe even better normal material. There we go. Okay, so that's like the planetary option. The other thing that would be nice to do is there was this kind of pulse happening, but it wasn't actually going into 3D. Let's temporarily turn off our planet. Could actually let that pulse move things in a z-axis. So pulse was being added to their size, which might still be interesting to have there. It's a question if that should still be there or should it be taken away. Let's test taking it away for a minute. So this might get boring all of a sudden. Hopefully it hasn't already been. And now I'm going to do a translate 0, 0 pulse. And there, that is way too much now. So now pulse could just be a small thing like 50. And now we actually get these things bending in 3D space, which I think if I look straight down on it, should look, if I start it over, should look similar to what we saw before in 2D. Except it's way calmer if I go back to like, or 150. Ooh, that's interesting that now those lines actually come at us. It's maybe nice that I don't need to change the stroke weight all the time, so maybe I override this and just say stroke weight is 5 or 4 because their z-axis is also creating all kinds of fun stroke size for us. It's just actually literally getting closer and further away. This is with perspective. Let's turn off perspective for a minute. And then things just appear and disappear. That's interesting. I think it's based on the cutoff for 3D space where the camera kind of cuts things off. So I don't actually want that. I think I like it more with the perspective, which is really cool the minute you change the perspective a little bit and then you can see what exactly is happening. And then when you can change the perspective, then that's a huge amount. So it doesn't need to be so many. And then it's a question, how many can my computer handle to fill this thing up and make it more dense, maybe with even less z-axis change in there, like 20. It kind of pauses for a minute when I drag this thing around so I can tell it's really happy when it gets moved. What happens if we leave them where they are? So go back. Let's maybe bring this down a bit so it's not so hard on it. And what happens if we do some rotations with that pulse value? So if I did like rotate X, pulse. Then that looks a lot like when you just rotate an ellipse. That's not so different. Y, I think it's because I'm not doing actually any push and popping. So the translate was also maybe messing them all up. I forgot to push and pop them. Let's add a push and a pop around these shapes and try that translate again. Here, this was up to 350. Okay, I think that makes more sense. So they're not all being manipulated on the previous one's manipulation. They're each kind of doing their own thing, and they don't know what the other one's doing. So that way, if there was rotate involved, yeah, they're each spinning on their own axes. Yeah, but I think as arcs, they don't really need rotate at all. I don't think it's helping. It creates some chaos. Too much. Okay, but this Z-axis manipulation is quite cool. Maybe I'll freeze the things for a little bit and see what this looks like when things aren't constantly moving around in motion. So that's them fixed on 1 degree. If I just got rid of the frame count, that's them fixed on that degree. Now this thing kind of breathes in 3D space. This is maybe a helpful way to test out those relationships without it in motion, so you can see what they'll look like before they go in motion, but then maybe everything changes the minute you add that frame count. Yeah, I think it's quite interesting when you're without the orbit control, just playing with that 3D space of them actually coming at you. And maybe that's interesting to let me test not using pulse, but instead say frame count modulo 200. Actually more like 500. And then they'll need to offset actually because they're all moving together. So this should have like a bracket I times 5 plus. Or even 25. It's a little choppy, but then like they're taking turns coming at the camera and resetting back at the beginning. Going pretty slow. There we go. Yep, infinitely messing with these numbers. This creates sort of, let me make those things not as big as they are. Starts to become a kind of like beaming off into space. Satellite signals going out. They're going 500 off into space, maybe 200 is enough. It's interesting what it looks like from the side. They're going really fast. What else do we want to play with these things? Could be interesting as well, having multiple arcs on the same space. I'm not such a fan of this like chop, chop, chop that the translate is doing. Let's go back to pulse. It's interesting just having that slight three-dimensional quality that when it's straight on we can't really see so well. I'm going to draw everything on a layer once so that we can have this 3D and have some tracing behind. I'll just call it layer. Tell the layer to be Webgl. Maybe before I do this, let's clone it one more time. And just say, make sure we're on this one. We are. Clone, and let's call this thing layer. And put everything onto the layer. So the angle mode is about the layer. The color mode is about the layer. We won't do any more orbit control. We have to reset this thing. This is going to get chaotic for a minute. Lay.clear. Lay has no fill. Background is clear, but we'll eventually want this fading quality. And then basically everything here just needs lay in front of it, except the push and pops. There we go. And then we have to show ourselves the layer. And maybe I will say image mode center. And turn off Webgl. So it's going to go back up to the corner. And move the translate for this picture back to the center. Oh, this is breaking, I'm guessing. There we go. Okay, so now we have 3D on a 2D world. Can give it a little bit more opacity so it's not leaving such a long trace. I think now we're slowly creating one of these LED fans that spins really fast and gives you a kind of pixel vision. I'll let the thing get bigger so it's immersive again. Actually, before I do that, I think we'll just do some rotation and see what this thing looks like in motion. So rotate X, frame count, divided by 2. And now that pulse is such a small amount that it's moving up and down. If it is at all, I don't think it is. It might be, it probably has to be on the layer. Lay.push, lay.translate, lay.pop. There we go. And chaos. Why is that chaos? Maybe because the push and pop don't go on the layer. Nope, they do. Strange, it seems like they're all reacting to each other. Is it because my angle mode is in degrees? Interesting. Yep, this thing has to be much less for some reason. The fan is kicking up nicely. I'm going to test out these things being lower resolution. Yeah, I don't know if that's much better. I think I'm about ready to ditch the sketch and go back to the 2D version, which was doing all kinds of fun things with less going on. If this thing spins fast enough, you can quickly create a sphere, I'm guessing, just to see what it does. All right, breaking it. Yep, so that was Webgl as a 2D layer. I think this original one was actually the nicest before going into that Webgl. It just had such a smooth quality on those arcs. So I'm going to clone this again. And maybe as we wrap up, try to see where some interesting spots are that mouse X should play a role. Maybe this is mouse Y. Maybe what would be a nice spot? The pulse could be a mouse X to control. Just how much those things move from just a little bit to a lot. Maybe their stroke weight should be controlled by the mouse as well. Mouse X divided by 10. That's also interesting, letting these things be huge and what happens when they're overlapping. It might be hard to see there. That creates some interesting breaking into each other. We can't really see it. Maybe if I make this bigger gaps of color, you can see it. There we go. Yeah, that's a trip. Having just really thick strokes. Interesting. One little change. All of a sudden that thing becomes, yeah, more graphic in a wild illusion way. It's quite nice how those things open up and close. Looks like we are squeezing a bottle of toothpaste, some Crest toothpaste, or some kind of swirly toothpaste out of the tube. Have to remember to move the mouse up and down to play with that relationship. It might be interesting just to keep one of the colors constant instead of these two different colors. Ooh, that's nice. Yeah, there's certain spots where the relationship between the two is really nice, and then others where it gets lost. Yeah, so this might just be where it needs to just have two different strokes all together for this 70s poster to have better stripes. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this instruction, copy paste, leave one alone that's just like so, and then I'm just going to say if I modulo 2 equals 0, do this one. And what is this one? This will be like, maybe it could be constant. We can see what that's like if it's always red. Is intense. It could be always whatever 40 is. That's hard to see right now. Purple, maybe it's interesting just take away the saturation. So then it's white lines in there. Or see what it's like with black lines. Let's make it 0. Or we always calculate the other number and make it the opposite of it. That might also be a nice way to go. So this thing's a little jumpy while I move the mouse around. I set myself up for that. Let's say let straw equal this value. Actually, this is more like the hue. So let's call it hue, and then let's say this is 100 minus hue, and bring back its saturation, bring back its brightness. There we go. So now we should be safe that no matter what the value shifts into, we always get the opposite of it on this spectrum. I don't know about the opposite, but we get the inverse of it, I'd say. And then it's a question, yeah, what is the right relationship you can get from this nice sort of LED bike light spinning patterns. Those are quite cool things that can go on bikes or these spinning fan displays, to a nice 70s trippy vision painted out colors. And somewhere in between. It's nice where it's, I think when it has some big lines, you risk having a couple flashes in there. But then you can really get some nice, Beetlejuicy stripes happening. It also kind of looks like a weird remix on this location pin thing that we're used to seeing. All kinds of trippy things happening. So we've hit 10 o'clock. I hope you have enjoyed watching some improvised live coded visuals here in P5Live. Hope you'll join us next week, every Tuesday, 9 p.m. Central European Time. Have a great New Year's. Have a great rest of 2020, as great as you can make it, and see you in 21. Thanks for watching.